Individualism and collectivism. So when most of us think about this, we might think about politics, we might think about economics or society in general, um, often represented by capitalism being on the individualistic side and communism or degrees of socialism on the collectivist side. And those are true, those are useful, those are things that play out constantly in modern life. Um, but my hypothesis is that these are actually fundamental competing drives in all of us, and they're fundamental competing drives psychologically as well as biologically. Um, so my evidence is, looking at biology, 4.2 billion years ago, the first life seems to have showed up on Earth. It was all single-celled organisms up until 600 million years ago, which means a really, really, really long time, all life was single-celled. And even today, most life on Earth is single-celled organisms. Even though that's not what we directly think we're interacting with, most of the life is single-celled organisms. Um, so my point in that is saying that the single-celled organisms are very successful, evolutionarily speaking. But at a certain point, our ancestors started working together as groups. And you have groups of individual single cells working together in synchrony and harmony to be better off than they would be alone. And so they start becoming colonies of individuals. And colonies are a fascinating thing to look at because they're not quite, even though they're colonies of individuals, they can function like like an organism. But for a number of biological reasons, they're not. They're not a single cell or a single organism with many cells. And then they jump to multicellular life. And often what you'll find is colonies will start out being, in a sense, egalitarian. It's a bunch of individual cells that are all basically the same, and they just work together. And then as colonies progress, you'll start to see more and more specialization within them. Some cells do one thing, some cells do another thing, and then you get to an organism which tends to have, a lot of differentiation in what cells do and don't do. Different cells doing different jobs. And then we see the exact same pattern play out. We see individual organisms, and then we see colonies of individual organisms. Some colonies are very equal, in a sense egalitarian, like a coral reef. Each coral, there's going to be some differences between them, of course, but they're not specialized. They're each a whole organism that basically lives in a city of other coral organisms. And so they all live their individual lives, but they get benefits from being all around each other. And then there are times when it functions like an organism, one organism. And then you see things like colonies of fish, colonies of birds, where still not much specialization going on, but there's a bunch of organisms, a bunch of individuals, and in some ways it makes sense to see it as a collection of individuals, but in other ways it makes more sense to see it as a superorganism. So like a school of fish often acts like a single organism. A flock of birds all changes direction at once. Scientists studied it for years, and they looked for the bird that made the decision and tried to figure out how they got the message across so quickly because it looks instantaneous. And they couldn't isolate a single bird making the decision. The entire flock makes decisions. But then, with a flock of birds, then when it's time to rest, they disperse, and now they're back to being individuals, more or less. They take care of their own needs at night and all that stuff. But then when they fly together as a flock, they literally become of one mind, and they move together and they switch directions together. And in that regard, the flock itself is the organism. Same with a colony of bees, or ants or termites, or a lot of colonies like that. What's interesting about them is they have a high degree of specialization, very, very rigid caste system. And if you look at it as a group of individuals, it makes a certain amount of sense. And then there's also, as a group of individuals, it's like, man, I pity the drones. I would hate to be a drone worker, but if you look at it as an organism, as if the hive itself is the organism, then somehow that inequality just doesn't even make sense to see it that way. It's what works best for the hive, and it works really, really well for the hive to function that way. And so humans have this same. So if we look at our social structure historically, it's been a long time since our ancestors worked as like an individual, animal. But as far back as the great apes, when our line diverged from them, we were living in, small extended family troops. And if you look at modern hunter-gatherers and our historical ancestors that were hunter-gatherers, they live in pretty small groups of people. These bands of hunter-gatherers, and then sometimes bands will come together and become a larger tribe. And then as the scale keeps going up, and has been part of the story through history of larger and larger alliances, then you get, chiefdoms and kingdoms and nation states and empires, and the group itself becomes larger and larger. And so within a hunter-gatherer band, maybe you got 40 people that you identify with as part of your group. And so there's it's a fairly clear interplay between I am myself, but I am also of these people. I'm part of this group. I'm part of this community. And there's a very, very natural and instinctual desire to be part of the group and to feel responsibility towards the group, to be willing to sacrifice for the group itself. But then as things get larger and larger and the scale gets bigger, those become abstract concepts, and they become more ideological than they're still emotional, but they're the scale of identifying with, the nation state. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of millions of people. And so often what we do is we look for smaller things to identify with, whether that's people of your religion or people of your ethnicity or people who came from your hometown or live in your hometown or people, who like the same sports teams as I. We have this desire to be part of something greater than ourselves. And so this plays out psychologically in the sense of, the individualism, it's akin to the idea of having a healthy ego of I exist and I have to take care of my own existence. If I didn't have a sense of self, I wouldn't exist. If I didn't have any sense of self, any ego, we perish. But there's also a fundamental human instinct to be part of a community, to be part of something greater than ourselves. And so, part of the question is, what do we identify with as the greater thing? Because that greater collective then becomes a new I. If you're part of a team, then part of the deal is you sacrifice some of your own individual autonomy in order to become part of something greater. Being a good team player means you're not putting yourself first. That you're putting the team first, and you figure out what role you need to play to be part of that team. And that could be a sports team, that could be, a business team, it could be a family. It doesn't matter. It's the same idea. And that self-sacrifice also leads to some degree of specialization. I'll do one job, so you do another job, so it gets handled. I also just want to mention, this is because these are fundamental drives. There's pros and cons to both. There's a shadow side to both of these things. So individualism, on the plus side, it allows for creativity and freedom of expression. In America, part of our ideology is this individualistic mindset, which allows for some truly wonderful things. It means you can walk away from a tradition you don't like, and it means you can move. It means you can worship how you choose. It means all these things where you can make your own decisions, find your own expression. You can be more innovative. We're not bound by a tradition nearly as much. And so some of these have really, really positive attributes. But then the negative side is, the individualism also is part of the narcissism and part of the greed. The plus side of individualism is one of the sides is live and let live. It means you do your thing, I'll do my thing. As long as everybody can be cool with that, then we can all be cool with that. The downside to that same sentiment is live and let die. That's where you have billionaires stepping over, homeless people who are starving and not caring. Tough luck, whatever. It's not my responsibility. That's some of the shadow side of individualism is the greed, the narcissism, the callousness to our own effects on others. It's, there's a real kind of fear of existence locked into that. It's, hey, I got to get mine. I don't, it's not my job. I don't have a job to think about anybody else or caring about anybody else. I got to get mine. And so that's part of the shadow of individualism. And likewise with collectivism, there's some real beautiful aspects of it. There's the compassion and empathy of caring about other people, even people you haven't ever met, even people, on the other side of the globe. There's part of the collectivist ideology is, we're all in this together. We're all fundamentally, part of the same family. And there's a desire for equitability, and there's a desire for fairness, and a desire to look out for one another, and those are some really beautiful aspects of collectivism. And then there's some not so beautiful aspects, the shadow side of collectivism, where I am my brother's keeper becomes I am my brother's keeper, and I get to tell them what to do. And we see this on kind of the left and the right of the political spectrum, is this kind of almost totalitarian mindset, because, hey, we're all in this together, so we need to be in lockstep. We need to do the same things, or think the same things, or speak the same ways. We need to do all the things together. There's conformity is an inherent aspect of it. And so there's some real pros and cons to both sides, and that's the dance is how do, individualistic in what way and collectivistic in what ways. And it plays out, both of these things exist in every culture and in every political schema, even if it's identified more one way or the other. Both of these drives exist, and they have to be accounted for because they will show up. One more thing I want to say about it, which is, we all have a drive towards collectivism. It's part of the inherent desire for community and need for community. And like I said, that can scale, up to, identifying with the nation state or the empire, but there is this fundamental drive to identify with something greater than yourself. And that can play out a lot of ways. And is that me and my extended family? Is that me and the people who live in my town? Or is that me and my countrymen? Is that me and my local ecology and the specific trees and streams and the fish that live in them? Is that me and all of humanity as one family? Or is that me and the entire biosphere and all of life? And depending on what you associate with, what you identify as the collective you're in, will give very different views of the world, So food for thought. I hope that made sense. Ask me if you got any questions. Let me know if you got any comments. Civil discourse is always welcome. Take it easy.